So in previous lectures, we talked about the elicitation analysis components of the requirements engineering process. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about this specification part of this requirements engineering process. So let's go ahead and label this specification. Now, to begin, we can pretty much define the specification process as a contract of agreement. Now, what I mean by contract of agreement is that the specification portion deals with a requirements documentation. So let's imagine we did the elicitation process and we developed this requirements documentation, which we've talked about in previous lectures. So then we have our requirements, we have it formatted into the purpose, all the different sections that we need in a requirements documentation. And then we present this to, so let me just go ahead and switch colors. We present this to our client. So we present this requirements documentation to client just to make sure that, hey, are these requirements correct? And it'll really save you some time. And I guess it could potentially save you some time in later processes when you deliver the final product and the requirements are correct rather than they're wrong. Because like I mentioned before, a requirement error can be 100 times more costly as if you caught it before you started coding. So this is just an attempt to save time, code, and money. So this contract of agreement has a few different qualities very similar to the software qualities we talked in a previous lecture that it should satisfy, because this is a documentation, it's about requirements, it should be very specific, has very important, very precise language associated with it. Otherwise, you will get those requirement errors that will cost you in the long run. So I'm going to go ahead and just write out these different terminologies, and I'll just define them as I go. So first we have consistent. And you want your requirements to be consistent because you don't want requirements that contradict one another. So let's say we have requirement 1 and we have requirement 2. And let's say requirement 1 is you want a specific task done in under 60 seconds. And let's say requirement 2 is you want that same task done in more than 60 seconds. Well, obviously we can see that these two requirements contradict one another, so we can't have both. We have to have either the task done in under 60 seconds or the task done in over 60 seconds, or just not have either requirement, because there's no way we can satisfy both of these. Next, we want our requirement specification to be complete. So we want all of our requirements, our requirement documentation, to really illustrate or reflect all the information we gathered in the elicitation process. We want to make sure all the client's needs are satisfied. We don't want to forget any requirements and have to go back and change the nature of the system. Just incorporate one requirement that we as developers didn't think the client really wanted or was a high priority. So communication is very important between the developers and the client, so we can create this very accurate requirements documentation. And next, we want our requirements to be verifiable. Now, what is verifiable? We've talked about this a few different times in previous lectures, but I'll go ahead and reiterate what it is. So let's say we stick with this first requirement. We want it done in under 60 seconds, and we test it, and we see that it runs in 58 seconds. So we say this requirement is satisfied, this requirement is complete. And that, in a nutshell, is what verifiability is. We want to be able to verify that this requirement can either be completed or uncompleted. So by saying it has to be under 60 seconds, we can easily test to see if a task runs in under a minute. And that's really all verifiable is. It's being able to run a test to approve or reject that requirement being satisfied. Next, we have traceable. So traceability is being able to take, let's say we start off with this requirement and we go to our test cases, which we'll cover in a different lecture. Then we have our code for the test cases, and then we run our tests, and then ultimately we accept that as being true. So our test case is running a specific instant with this code, and our test to see if it runs under 60 seconds, and we see that it is actually 58 seconds, so that causes us to accept the requirement as verified. as complete. So traceable is just being able to take this requirement and able to trace it to a single line of code, or take this code and be able to trace it to the requirement. So just being able to create this link of requirement to test artifact, which includes the code and all those different parts that require to test it and to approve or deny that requirement as being complete. And then these next three are really similar, and we've gone over them before with software qualities, but I'll go ahead and write them down right here. Then unambiguous as the third one, so we have precise, clear, and unambiguous. Naturally, we want our software, well, of course our software, but also our requirements to be precise, clear, and unambiguous, because like I said before, if we get a requirement error in that final delivery process, then that's going to cost us 100 times more, it's going to be 100 times more costly to fix than if it was caught in the coding stages of the software development lifecycle. So we want pretty much all these three vocabulary words are telling us we want our requirements to be very clear cut. We don't want two developers being able to read the same requirement and get two different meanings or two very different solutions. So we don't want them to read this. Let's say that we had this less than 60 seconds was the initial requirement, but how we wrote it, it was very ambiguous. It was really hard to understand. And we had one developer that thought it meant less than, and one developer that thought it meant greater than. And then we have to kind of go back and forth to see who's right, and we might end up going with this second requirement that is in fact incorrect, which will lead us to a wrong requirement when we do the final delivery of the system to the client. And again, that's going to be 100 times more costly than if we just wrote a very precise, clear, and well-defined requirement in the first place. And in a nutshell, that's pretty much what specification is in the requirements engineering process. It's just creating this documentation of the requirements that all the information you got and analyzed in the first two steps, and put it into a documentation. The next step would do validation, where we validate these requirements with the client and with the other information we gathered. And there's a lot of different industry standard layouts and templates for this requirements document. One that's very popular is the IEEE standard, but you can find other ones on the internet. So in the first lecture of the requirements engineering, we talked about these four different parts of the process. Then we talked about elicitation, which is just gathering information. We talked about analysis, which is analyzing that information and creating requirements. And specification is taking those requirements and putting it into a document. So we've finished that lecture, and next we'll talk about validation, which is when we take that document and validate it and just prove that these are the requirements that we need to satisfy.